As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
We sort of want to hit the pause button on cancel culture in most situations. So, of course, there are going to be instances where canceling someone is the appropriate response if they've done something truly egregious or they're repeatedly doing something bad. But in most ordinary situations where we're interacting with each other in workplace environments, educational environments, social environments, we think it's much better to display generosity to each other when we make mistakes and to give each other kind of tools for growing and learning so that we can activate more of a growth mindset.
That was David Glasgow on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are three clinical psychologists here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas from psychology to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act Daily Journal, the Act Daily Card Deck, and the upcoming book, Act for Burnout.
I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, a Boston-based clinical psychologist, assistant professor at Brown University, and author of the book Work, Parent, Thrive.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, the Big Book of Act Metaphors, and the upcoming Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. I'm here with Debbie to introduce today's episode with David Glasgow about his book, Say the Right Thing, How to Talk About Identity, Diversity, and Justice. And I really appreciated this conversation because David really gives some concrete advice around what we tend to do when we have difficult identity conversations and basically what not to do and how we can do things better. So, Debbie, what was your reaction to the episode?
Well, I'm really glad that you brought David on. I think this was a terrific conversation. And I love, yes, there are some strategies for what to do, what not to do, but you also just touched on a number of really important topics related to having conversations about diversity and identity and justice. So I really appreciate that. And I do appreciate having some ideas for how to have these conversations because, they can be scary and emotionally loaded for people. There was one of the topics that came up in the conversation that I just kind of wanted to talk about a little bit more in the co-host intro because I thought it was really important and really interesting. And that is, when we have some emotional discomfort around having these hard conversations. And of course, these conversations can be painful. There can be anger and fear and shame that shows up. And one of the things he talks about, okay, what do you do with your discomfort? Like, are you channeling it to the right place? And he has this idea you'll hear in the episode about the rings and like, who do you go to when you're feeling discomfort? And sometimes we kind of misplace that and put the burden of our discomfort. If we're in a more privileged group, we might place that burden of our discomfort on, maybe the person of color or the person who is in the more marginalized group. And it reminded me, I recently saw this documentary. They did a screening of it in Denver called Deconstructing Karen. And it features the work of these two women, Regina Jackson and Syra Rao, who they also have a book, which I've read, called White Women: Everything You Already Know About Your Own Racism and How to Do Better. Highly recommend both the documentary and the book if anyone wants to do more of this kind of work, which if you're listening, I assume you want to do better. But what's so interesting is that Regina and Syra have these dinners with a group of white women, and they come together and they talk very candidly and openly about racism and about their experience of white women. And ultimately, they are trying to help white women do better, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to teach them some things and to, we really need to be talking about this if things are going to change.
What a cool idea. That's really, really interesting. I would love to participate in something like that. Or, well, I would be terrified to participate in something like that. And isn't that kind of the whole point? And David talks about the democratization of discomfort and how, we've arrived at a place where we can't expect just the marginalized people to be the ones shouldering the discomfort and being in charge of kind of moderating these conversations that, we all, especially people who are in positions of privilege or power, need to take on some of this burden. And I love that. I think that's such an interesting idea. And I give them a lot of credit for taking that on. And I give the women who attend a lot of credit for being willing to have those conversations.
Right. I mean, it is, I think, a courageous thing to do on both ends. And you see one of the dinners actually in the film, if you watch the documentary. And one part of it, so there's a lot of really fascinating things about this work. Like if you get into it, if you go to a dinner or if you just read the book or watch the documentary, it's very interesting. But one piece of it is related to this idea of emotional discomfort, because what often happens is that conversations, for instance, about race, end up centering on the comfort of the white person, right? So either the white person is so shocked by all the racism that they've experienced, and then their shock becomes the center, or, their tears that come up when they feel ashamed or sad or called out. And basically, in part of these dinners is to say, that's not helpful to us. We need you to kind of hold that and stick with this conversation. If not, you need to leave the room and then come back when you can participate in the conversation. Because what they're trying to avoid is what so often happens, which is that they then end up in the position of comforting the white person, or the conversation gets shut down because there's that, that idea of white fragility. It's like, well, they can't handle it, so we can't talk about this. And it's like, we're not going to get anywhere if that's the case. And so I think that it's really, in this conversation, it's great to think about this in a new way and to have some of those tools. How do you wade into this? How do you hold your discomfort so that we can move forward?
Yeah. And David talks about this idea of ally tiers, which is exactly what you're talking about with these other resources, and the importance, one of the steps that he gives us for getting better at these conversations is building resilience. It's learning how to manage our own emotions on our own so that that doesn't become the center of these kinds of conversations. And he gives some tips for how to do that. And, like you said in the beginning, he brings up, I think, so many kind of hot button topics. We talk about cancel culture and kind of his views about cancel culture. We talk about privilege, that word privilege that's become kind of a buzzword, and the definition, like actually what it does and doesn't actually mean, and a number of other, I think, really important and timely kinds of topics. So we hope you enjoy this episode with David Glasgow. Hey everybody, it's Jill here, and I'm excited to introduce my guest today, David Glasgow. We're going to be talking about his book, Say the Right Thing: How to Talk About Identity, Diversity, and Justice. And I think this is such an incredibly important topic, especially where we seem to be living in a much more divided society where these conversations about identity have become very difficult. So I think this is going to be a great interview today. David Glasgow is the executive director of the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, and an adjunct professor at NYU School of Law. He has written for a range of publications, including the Harvard Business Review, HuffPost, and Slate, and served as an associate director of the Public Interest Law Center at NYU School of Law. He is the co-author with Kenji Yoshino of Say the Right Thing: How to Talk About Identity, Diversity, and Justice. David, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here on Psychologists Off the Clock.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So I thought where we could start is, before we jump into the content of the book, if you could tell us a little bit about you. So what led you to this specific type of work and who you wrote this book for?
Absolutely. So my background is actually as a lawyer. So I trained in Australia and practiced employment and labor and anti-discrimination law. But I was never really sort of in love with the law, and I was always much more interested in deeper issues of social justice and equality and inclusion that the law can help address, but not sort of fully solve on its own. And I was always interested in how do you build cultures and societies that are inclusive, where everyone has a sense of belonging over and above whatever the legal requirements are? Because as a lawyer, you're so often just thinking about, is this going to get a business in trouble or a person in trouble in a courtroom or something, and not thinking so much about, what else can we do to treat people with dignity and respect? And so I entered this field of diversity, equity, and inclusion really in an attempt to do that additional work of what the law can't really achieve on its own. And I was drawn to it both for that professional reason and also just for, personal reasons. I'm a gay man myself. I remember growing up feeling a kind of lack of belonging in my own life, and I wanted to be able to think about how to create more inclusive cultures, not just for people like me, but for other people who might be experiencing a lack of belonging in other areas. And so why, who we wrote this book for is really intended for any person of goodwill who wants to learn how to engage in more effective conversations about issues of identity, diversity, and justice. So it's a really broad intended audience. It's really sort of anyone who cares about treating people with inclusion and respect, but is maybe fearful of getting it wrong, fearful of saying the wrong thing, and just needs some guidance for how to do it effectively.
Yeah, I love it. Well, and that's a perfect segue. And you may have just answered the question really in that final part there, because I think so many of us care, so many of us are the right audience for this book. And yet these conversations about identity seem to be so hard. And so you just mentioned fear. Is there anything else? Like, what makes these conversations so hard? Why do we shy away from having them?
So a big thing that's changed, I think, recently is what the social psychologist Jennifer Richardson calls the democratization of discomfort. So she points out that, historically, members of, marginalized groups, if you're a person of color, a member of the LGBTQ community, a woman, these conversations have really been uncomfortable for a very long time for you. It's just that you may not have had the power to be able to speak up and challenge some of the ways that these conversations are conducted. And so over the past decade or so, a big shift that's happened is we've had a tremendous number of social movements, right? LGBTQ movement, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, and on and on. And as a result of that courageous activism, even members of more historically dominant or majority groups are starting to feel tremendous discomfort in these conversations as well. So they're now feeling, oh my goodness, what if I, say something that offends or hurts someone I care about? Or what if I get canceled? So the stakes of these conversations just seem to have gotten a lot higher for people. I think that's a big reason why people are finding it challenging. Another is generational. So, younger generations coming through are being raised in much more diverse environments, are much more fluent and comfortable with the language of identity. And they're often entering environments and bringing these conversations to the fore in ways that are making some members of older generations feel uncomfortable. So in researching the book, I remember a corporate leader telling me that his experience in his workplace is that young people are coming in as new hires and they're saying things to their bosses, their colleagues, like, we need to talk about the white supremacy and racism in this workplace. And people in the workplace from older generations react to that with, as you say, tremendous fear of, oh my goodness, are you telling us we're all racists and white supremacists? What's going on here? And so I think that generational conflict and misunderstanding is also contributing to this difficulty.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to talk a little bit about that language in a minute, that word white supremacist, that how it conjures certain ideas about what this means and whatnot. But you brought up cancel culture. And so it seems like people are uncomfortable partly because you said generationally, these conversations are new, but this other piece is that there's so much fear. And one thing I was thinking as I was reading is, in a way, this is sort of a good sign because it means we deeply care about our communities and about our connections, right? Like we wouldn't have fear if we didn't worry about offending someone or being canceled, as you say. And So it seems like we just need more effective ways of navigating these conversations, which is exactly what the entire book is about. But I want to talk about this canceled thing because I think that is one of the big fears, right? There's the fear just, you and me as a dyad, if we have a relationship, I don't want to offend you. I don't want it to ruin our relationship. But on a larger level, it's that fear that I'm going to make such a big mistake, like my life will be over. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about cancel culture.
Yeah. So, as you say, we actually welcome the democratization of discomfort. I think it's a good thing that people from more dominant or majority groups are feeling uncomfortable. I don't think it's fair that the burden of these conversations should only fall on one side. So, the reason we wrote the book is, as you say, really not to tell people you shouldn't feel uncomfortable at all, but rather to give some people practical tools for navigating it so that even though they feel uncomfortable, they can still show up and engage effectively in these conversations. But, as you point out, I think one barrier is this fear of cancellation. And we argue in the book that we sort of want to hit the pause button on cancel culture in most situations. So, of course, there are going to be instances where canceling someone is the appropriate response if they've done something truly egregious or they're repeatedly doing something bad, even though they've been counseled and, given tools to do better. But in most ordinary situations where we're interacting with each other in, workplace environments, educational environments, social environments, we think it's much better to display generosity to each other when we make mistakes and to give each other kind of tools for growing and learning so that we can activate more of a growth mindset in people, which I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with that basic concept from Carol Dweck's work of a growth mindset, of kind of treating mistakes as opportunities to learn and thinking about this area as one in which you can actually improve through effort. It's not just a fixed innate, skill that you either have or you don't have. And cancel culture really shuts down that growth mindset thinking. Cancel culture really treats people as, you're either good or you're bad, you're either in the community or you're not in the community. And what we would much prefer to do is create a culture where we're all sort of generous to each other when we make mistakes so that we're all learning and growing together.
Yeah, I love that. That really stood out to me. And I think if I'm remembering correctly in the book, it was Dolly Chugg, who was also a guest on our podcast to talk about More Just Future is the name of her book. And she had talked about the importance of applying the fixed versus growth mindset specifically to identity conversations. And I mean, it just makes so much sense. And I think any of us, our listeners, certainly this is true of me. I can look back on many instances in my own life that, to be honest, are just cringy because I didn't know better. Things I thought or things I said that, I think about these things in a much different way now. I approach them differently. And we're all at different stages of learning and development. And this is really an ongoing process. So I think that point cannot be underestimated how important that really is.
Yeah. And it's fascinating, Jill, to, I think we all have that experience of looking back at our past and kind of cringing. But it's interesting how in other areas of life, if you're learning something new, if you're learning how to speak a new language or you're learning a musical instrument or what have you, it's inevitable that you make mistakes. And, it's unlikely that you think back, oh my goodness, I can't believe that, 10 years ago, I missed that shot in my tennis match or something. So I think that really speaks to the fact that in this domain, we tend to get stuck, as Dolly Chugg says, in that fixed mindset where we treat our mistakes not as things that we can recover from, but we treat them as, implicating who we are as people, of sort of turning us into racists or sexists or homophobes or what have you. And I think her point around really trying to bring that growth mindset into this domain is just a crucial one.
Right. And I think it triggers shame. When I say, ooh, I cringe, what I feel is shame. And you're right. When I look back on learning how to ride a bike, I don't cringe or feel shame that I fell down a few times before I got the hang of it. But I think like the flip side of this that is maybe making me feel kind of hopeful and optimistic, like I said before, is the reason we feel shame is because this matters to us. Like the last thing on earth I want to be is racist or sexist or homophobic or any of those things, because I care about my fellow humans and I respect them and I want to understand them as best I can. And, I think if we didn't want that harmony, that community, that cooperation, all of it, then these aren't the feelings that would be triggered around these conversations. So to me, that's like really hopeful. And now we need to figure out like how to move forward, not get into that fixed mindset and be willing to learn and grow and put ourselves out there and be vulnerable and make mistakes.
Yeah, I love that because, oftentimes when we feel negative emotions, we tend to think we need to squash it, right? If I'm feeling afraid or if I'm feeling guilty or what have you, this is bad and I need to just sort of run away from the emotion. But I think what's much healthier is to process it in the way that you just described of thinking, well, if I'm feeling, guilt about an error that I've just made, that indicates to me that I care about this person that I've just hurt. And so I need to see that as a productive emotion. And it's just rather than sort of wallowing and getting stuck in self-pity and what have you, I need to think about ways to productively move forward with that.
Right. Absolutely. Well, so let's talk a little bit about this moving forward piece. So you say part of what gets us into trouble is when it comes to these, the difficult identity conversations, that we're often reactive rather than being reflective. And that this typically presents as one of 4 conversational traps. So I'm wondering if you could talk, this is kind of before we get to the what to do differently, this is sort of the kind of where we get stuck. So can you talk a little bit about what those traps are, those typical ways we might respond?
Yes. So we call this ADDA, which stands for avoid, deflect, deny, and attack. And, avoid is, what it sounds like. It's walking out of the room, it's going silent, looking at your phone, not really sharing what you think. It's just running away from the conversation. Deflect is where you change the subject. So someone has come to you to talk about an experience of theirs, and rather than focusing on the subject that they've raised with you, you change the topic. So you focus on the tone that they use to bring it up with you and say, well, you may have a point, but I really don't like the way you just put it now. Or you change the topic to your own good intentions. Oh, I didn't mean it that way. Or something about your own moral character. Like, oh, well, I'm a good person. I grew up in a diverse neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera. So that's all forms of deflection. Deny is where you stay on the subject that the person has raised with you, but you essentially put up a wall and you just reflexively dismiss whatever it is that they're telling you. So you might dismiss the facts and just say, no, you're completely wrong. No questions asked. Or you might dismiss their feelings, right? So just basically treating it as, well, you're a snowflake and why did you get upset about that kind of denial? And then the fourth one is the most aggressive, which is an attack, which is where you turn the tables on the other person and you make it quite personal. So you go after them with insults, sarcasm, eye rolling, that kind of behavior. And so if you think of it as almost like a fight or flight kind of response, the avoid and deflect are the flight responses, running away, and then the deny and attack are more the fight responses. I'm going to stand in my corner and fight you. But either way, we think that these 4 behaviors get in the way of true engagement with the other person. They have the effect of kind of shutting down important conversations.
Yeah, and they make so much sense because they're protective in some way in the moment, in the short term, but in the long term, of course, are not moving anything forward. Okay, so let's say you're aware of these 4 traps and you really want to do a better job of being reflective. I mean, reactive is that like snap, autopilot, just that thing you do without thinking. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about like, how do we start to turn down the reactivity and turn up the more reflective responding? I mean, the one thing that I was thinking about is I wonder how powerful like one slow breath would be. Like if we could even just catch that moment and take a breath before we respond. But I'm wondering if you have like specific tips or strategies that you teach people.
Yeah, so I love that idea of the breath. We write a chapter on resilience in the book, and it comes immediately after the chapter on these 4 conversational traps, because we think building that emotional resilience is a critical skill for overcoming this behavior. And so one of the components of that resilience is to try to adopt that growth mindset that we discussed. So if you make a mistake, you feel yourself getting uncomfortable because of that mistake, reframing it as, I can bounce back from this mistake. It's okay that I've made the mistake. It's like I've, played the wrong note on a piano piece or something, rather than I've become a horrible human being. I think that helps address some of these behaviors. And so you can it's as simple sometimes as adding the word yet to the end of a sentence. So if you find yourself with a self-talk thinking, I'm just not good at pronouns, for example, in a gender identity context, you might just add the word yet and say, I'm not good at pronouns yet, but I can learn more, I can practice, I can get better at it. And I think activating the growth mindset in that way can help. There's also, research in psychology. We draw on Robert Livingston, who's written a wonderful book called The Conversation, where he writes about the power of self-affirmation. So, before you enter some of these conversations, if you're feeling really uncomfortable, write down 3 things that are really important to you in your life that you value, that give your life meaning. So, relationships in your family, accomplishments, things that make you proud of who you are. Those kind of affirmations may sound irrelevant to the topic that you're talking about. And in fact, it's good that they're irrelevant. But what it does is it kind of gives you that kind of buffer of like a stronger self-concept so that when you enter these conversations, you can put your mistakes in a broader context. So you can actually think, there's so much more in my life that I value that's important to me than just getting this conversation right in this moment. And so that self-affirmation process can help. And then, we have, plenty of other tools in that resilience chapter as well. But just to mention one more, another one is to kind of catch yourself when you're feeling that overwhelming discomfort that makes you engage in ADDA behavior, and try to identify what specific emotion that you're feeling in that moment. So there's research on, affect labeling that says, just pausing to think about, well, am I feeling fear or anger or guilt or hopelessness or whatever it may be? Just naming that emotion takes some of the power of that emotion away from just kind of controlling the way that you're engaging in the conversation. And once you've named it, you can reframe it. You can actually think, is there a more productive, affirmative way that I can think about this emotion in this conversation? So, for example, let's say I confuse 2 people who belong to the same ethnic group with each other, and I'm feeling terrible guilt over that mistake. Rather than kind of wallowing in that guilt, think about, is there a way that I can reframe that to think, well, everyone makes mistakes. I'm going to apologize and learn their names and do better next time. And so that exercise of naming and reframing, we think, is also a powerful way to really turn down the temperature of the conversation in your own head and bring some of that ADDA behavior under control.
Yeah, and both of those, both the self-affirmations and the labeling of the emotions, bring self-compassion to mind for me.
Yes.
So self-compassion, where you're aware of your thoughts and feelings, your suffering, where you connect with common humanity. Like, I'm not alone here. This is something that so many people struggle with. And self-kindness. I'm a human being. Humans make mistakes. I'm going to try better. I'm going to apologize and try better next time. It fits really nicely into that frame as well. And cools the nervous system and makes it more likely that you're going to get back on track and try to do the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I think it's important for people to realize that it is okay to get that emotional support. Oftentimes when we're entering these conversations as allies, if you belong to a historically, dominant or majority sort of group in these conversations, if we're well-meaning people, we can sometimes think, well, I just need to, suck it up and be a superhero, and I shouldn't be feeling any of my own painful emotions in these conversations. Whereas we argue very much, as you say, that, having that self-compassion is important, and also getting support is important as well. It's just try not to get that support from the person in the conversation who you're there to help, right? So again, a psychologist, clinical psychologist Susan Silk has this framework called ring theory, where she asks people, it's applied in a grief context, right? So she asks people to imagine that, let's say your friend has cancer, imagine that person is in the center of a circle, and then draw a set of concentric circles around that person. And then in each layer of the concentric circle, add the name of a person who's one step removed from the person in the middle. So you might have the cancer patient in the middle, and then you're in the next circle out as that person's friend. And then your own family and friends and your network are in the next circle out from you. And so the rule from, Silk's theory is to comfort in and dump out. So if you're feeling negative emotions yourself, you're allowed to dump out those emotions. You're allowed to share it with people and say, I feel horrible about this diagnosis that my friend has. But you just shouldn't do it to the friend. You shouldn't do it into the inner circle. And we apply that to this context of allyship as well, where if someone comes to you, they're sharing a painful experience of discrimination or exclusion that they're feeling, they're pouring out their emotions to you, and you're feeling a whole bunch of negative emotions yourself, definitely have self-compassion, definitely seek support, go back to your spouse when you get home and talk to them about it and get that help that you need. Just try not to dump those negative emotions out to the person you're there to support, because then it can kind of suck the energy away from the conversation and the focus then goes to you rather than to them.
Right. That is so helpful. So this makes me think about what you talk about in the book in terms of ally tiers, that sometimes these conversations or situations are so hard that it can become really emotional, but then the conversation tips so that now it's no longer about this other person's pain, this marginalized person's pain. It becomes about me and my reaction to that pain, and that the ring theory really helps to understand what to do differently in that situation.
I'm someone who's quite emotional myself. I've been in situations where I've heard people tell painful stories and I find myself tearing up in those moments. And, that's an exercise in empathy. I think it's okay to feel those kind of emotions. I think what's important in those situations is to just be aware of what impact that might be having on the dynamics of the conversation. So, if you're feeling overcome by emotions to the point where the attention in the room all turns to kind of comforting you, and then the poor person who was raising their issue is now alone and isolated and left unsupported in the conversation, then I think in those instances, it's really powerful to just tell people, reassure people that you're okay and that you can, handle it, and then seek support outside the room from your own friends and family or what have you. But, I think, it is really connected to that ring theory, where I think it's okay to feel those emotions. It's just about having a bit of self-awareness about what impact that might be having on the conversation.
So while we're talking about building resilience, so that's you divide the book into 7 principles. So being aware of those 4 conversational traps is the first principle. Building resilience is the second, and that building resilience is the idea that these identity conversations trigger intense emotions, and we have to learn to better manage those emotions so we don't engage in the ADDA behaviors. And so one word that has become quite loaded and triggering, and I think that people maybe need to build resilience around, is the word privilege. And it's often misinterpreted as meaning you've had it easy. And I think this is really important. It comes up all the time. So can you clarify for us what privilege is and is not?
Absolutely. So typically when people talk about privilege, they're talking about what some, including Dolly Chugh, actually, we spoke about earlier, have likened to headwinds and tailwinds. So if you imagine jogging or you're on a flight or what have you, there are sort of invisible headwinds or barriers that are making it harder for you to go at the speed that you want to go at. And then alternatively, there might be tailwinds at your back that are kind of giving you these invisible boosts along the way. Now, I think one of the reasons I like that headwinds, tailwinds analogy for privilege is that it's really suggesting not that, privilege gets you the whole way, right? If you're a pilot, you can't just fly the plane entirely on the back of tailwinds. You still need to have the skill and to put in the effort, and you might have still worked hard and trained hard to be a pilot, and you might be excellent at flying the plane. It just means you're getting like some little invisible boosts along the way as you're flying, right? And that's how I like to think about privilege, is we all experience some mix of headwinds and tailwinds in our lives. So it may be, for example, that, I as a white man, for example, have experienced, tailwinds on account of the fact that I'm white and I'm a man. So I have not had barriers no one has denied me opportunities in my life because I'm white or because I'm a man. However, I have experienced some headwinds on account of my sexual orientation, on account of being gay. And I think if everyone kind of does that little exercise of just reflecting on what are the areas in my life where I have endured hardship and had it, more difficult than most people, and what are some areas where maybe I haven't had it as difficult as most people, I think that's really how I like to think about privilege, is it's multidimensional, and it's certainly not a definitive claim that you either have zero privilege or you have total privilege. It's really much more everyone's in that kind of messy middle.
Yeah, I loved that metaphor so much. I found it so helpful. And the other one that I had heard previously is it's sort of like if we're all running a race, people are starting at different starting points. Maybe you
Right.
have like a head start compared to other people. But I liked this so much better. And I just found it a really helpful way to conceptualize privilege. I wanted to read a quote from the book that's related to what we're talking about here. Going back to what we were saying about like white supremacy or privilege, like there are these words that are so loaded that people sort of react, they get reactive and kind of interpret, you're saying I'm sexist, you're saying I'm homophobic, you're saying I'm racist. And the emotional response to that requires some of that building resilience. And I wanted to read this quote. So the first part of the quote is, it's from the book, but you're quoting Ijeoma Oluo, quote, "If you are white in a white supremacist society, you are racist. If you are male in a patriarchy, you are sexist. If you are able-bodied, you are ableist. If you are anything above poverty in a capitalist society, you are classist." End quote. And then you say in the book, is Oluo saying all white individuals are torch-wielding Klanspeople or all men are virulent misogynists? No. She's just saying it's impossible to live in a biased society without bias seeping into your beliefs and actions. It would be a miracle if you didn't internalize what psychologist Beverly Daniel Tatum calls cultural smog, in the same way that someone who breathes in environmental smog every day would be a medical miracle if they had no traces of it in their lungs. On this understanding of bias, a person who perceives an assertive woman as bossy, but perceives an equivalently assertive man as confident is sexist. No hostility toward women is required. And I just thought that explained things so well, right? This idea of if you hear this word white supremacist, it doesn't mean you are a torch-wielding Klansperson, but that we swim in these waters and there is no escaping bias when this is the sociocultural fabric of which we have been part. So I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to say about that, but I just loved that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think this is where a lot of misunderstandings arise in identity conversations, and they can become a bit like car crashes because one side of the conversation is using these terms in that way that you've just described, more as a kind of cultural smog. And then the other side of the conversation is interpreting the language to mean I'm being personally singled out as a bad person with this language, right? So it's the difference between saying you, like most people in the society, are racist versus you, unlike most people in the society, are racist. And so we kind of argue in that section of the book that it's really important for people to mind the gap between their own perception of what they're hearing and what the other person might actually be saying. And it can be as simple as just actually having that conversation and asking, like sitting down with the person and saying, hey, when you used that term before, when you described this as racist or you threw out the word white supremacist or sexist or what have you, what did you mean by that? And oftentimes, when you actually have that conversation, you might find that there isn't so much of a gap in perception as what you really think. It's just that people are using that language differently from each other.
Right. And as you were saying before, that can even be a generational difference.
Absolutely.
Right,
and we sort of give an example of a colleague of ours, Rhonda, who's in her, 50s, and she had an experience like that with some folks in their early 20s who came into her organization and were using a lot of this language in their emails and other correspondence. And she started out by kind of freaking out about it and thinking that they were accusing her of essentially being a bigot. But when she sat down with them and just said, hey, when you're talking about this, what do you mean by that? They explained to her that they were actually more talking about more at the systemic level of thinking about what are some of the policies and practices that we have in this workplace and how can they be improved to be more, equitable and just for marginalized people in this workplace. And that's just a much different conversation than what she was expecting, where, they were going to put her on blast and tell her that she's a horrible person, right? So I think, just making sure that you're taking the time to process the feedback accurately and make sure you're on the same page with language is really important.
Yeah, and that just coming to these conversations with curiosity, openness, a willingness to have a dialogue, where I think what our automatic response, the reactive response, is making assumptions, having judgments, being defensive. And then we get into those 4 conversational traps. Yeah,
exactly.
I wanted to talk about one other strategy that you talk about for building resilience. And that was what you call right-sizing feedback. So if someone calls us out on our privilege or bias or whatever it may be, you suggest that we right-size the feedback. So can you talk about what you mean by that?
Yeah, this is drawn from a terrific book called Thanks for the Feedback, where it's not really in this context of diversity and inclusion that the authors Douglas Stone and Sheila Heen write about it. But if you think about, let's say you're having a performance review at work and your boss tells you something like, you need to improve your organizational skills. Now, your boss might just mean literally you need to improve your organizational skills. You might hear that though as an employee as you're a terrible employee who's never going to get promoted, right? Because we tend to have, as humans, we blow negative feedback out of proportion and we fixate on it and we think it means something much bigger than what it actually means to the person giving the feedback. And so we argue that you really need to carry over that same mentality of just trying to turn the volume down a little bit and think about, is this ominous soundtrack playing in my head really the truth of the feedback that the person was intending to convey to me, or am I blowing this feedback out of proportion? And so the way that you do that in this context is exactly like what I was just describing about the example of our friend Rhonda, which is, someone gives you feedback in this domain and says you're privileged or you're racist or whatever the case may be. Your immediate reaction might be like that workplace situation of sort of blowing that out of proportion and thinking that they're saying something horrible about you. But if you just take a beat to kind of pause, I love your idea of taking a breath, think about, maybe they did mean it like that. Maybe they didn't mean it like that. Maybe actually ask them what they meant by the term. You can actually then create the environment in which you can process the feedback accurately and learn from it rather than letting it overwhelm you.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so important. We have such a tendency to personalize things. I mean, going back to that just kind of shame and because we care about not being the thing we most fear, not being some sort of monster, but that we can so quickly flip into that assumption. And then that doesn't really put us in a very good spot to be able to have a productive conversation. Yeah. Okay. So let's say we've gotten to the point where, maybe we're a little bit better at reflecting rather than reacting. We've done some work around building resilience and can manage some of those negative emotional reactions. One of the things you talk about in the book is coming at things with curiosity. So having this like learner's mindset, like the growth mindset, trying to obtain more knowledge. And so without looking to stoke conflict, but wishing to respectfully disagree, like how do you recommend going about that? And maybe we can talk about an example if you have one.
For sure. So as you say, resilience and curiosity are really critical skills because I think sometimes when we think we disagree with someone, it might actually just be that we haven't adequately cultivated that resilience and curiosity. So we think we disagree, but maybe we are blowing the statement out of proportion, or maybe we're overwhelmed by the negative emotions that we're feeling. And once we actually right-size the feedback and get in a growth mindset, we realize that there isn't really a disagreement there. Or maybe we haven't learned enough about the subject. So if we're curious, if we're open to the fact that maybe we're wrong, we'll realize that we are wrong. And so there isn't really a disagreement there. But, my co-author Kenji and I strongly feel that there are still going to be situations in life where we're inevitably going to disagree with each other about these issues. And so we need some tools for navigating strategies around communicating that disagreement respectfully. And one of the really important tools that we offer in the book is just to recognize that not all disagreements are the same. And so we introduce this notion called a controversy scale. So if you imagine just a straight line from right to left, not a political kind of right to left, but just, a straight line. And then on the far left of the spectrum, just think about, a disagreement over taste. So if you and I are disagreeing over which flavor of ice cream is the best or what Netflix show we like the most, I mean, that's not generally a painful disagreement to have if you're having a disagreement over taste.
Pretty benign.
Yeah. But then if you sort of move along the spectrum, imagine that next to tastes is disagreeing over facts. Now, this is just who, what, when, how type facts, not like just journalistic facts, not deep values type facts, right? That's a little harder than tastes, but it's not as hard as if we have to disagree over policies. And then imagine again that we have to disagree over values. That becomes even harder. And then imagine on the far right of the controversy scale is where you disagree about the very equal humanity of the people that you're talking about. Now, we argue that, obviously the conversation is going to get more challenging the further along that spectrum you get toward the right. And what often happens in these conversations is that the ally person who's from a dominant or majority group is often at a very different point on the controversy scale to the person on the other side who's directly affected by something. So let's say you're a parent and your children's school has a set of programs around race or a diversity, equity, and inclusion in the curriculum. There's obviously been a huge, controversy and argument in the public domain in recent months around the way that issues of race and identity are taught in schools. So let's say that you're a parent of a white child in that school and you disagree with the approach that the school has taken to its diversity, equity, and inclusion curriculum. Now, you might just think about that topic as purely an issue of policy. So you might think, well, I'm arguing about how history should be taught in schools or what level of the curriculum is appropriate for different ages in the classroom. But let's say you're having that conversation with someone who's a parent of a child of color or a Black student at that classroom, for example. That parent might actually think that the disagreement is about the equal humanity of their child in the school, because their child perhaps is getting bullied because of the color of their skin in the classroom, or they don't feel like they belong in that environment and they feel like these diversity, equity, inclusion or race education programs are critical to their child's sense of belonging at the school. So you're treating it at one point on the controversy scale as a policy question. They're treating it on the end of the controversy scale as an equal humanity question. And so it's really important, we think, in those kind of conversations to just acknowledge the fact of what this conversation might mean to the other person and how it's different from your own perspective. So you might say something like, to me, I'm analyzing this question as an issue of policy, and I think there are some important policy issues to talk about. But I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that for you, this may actually have much deeper implications and be really important to you and your child's belonging at the school. And I want to make sure that as we're having this conversation, that I'm honoring and respecting that in the way that we have this conversation. I think, that simple acknowledgement, it's not going to make the conversation go easily. I think any disagreement on this topic is going to be hard no matter how you do it. But I think it signals basic empathy and perspective taking to be able to see that. And I think that makes it a little bit easier than it might otherwise have been if you had just barreled into the conversation, treating it totally as an issue of policy and not recognizing what it might mean to the other person.
Right. I think people get so rigid into this. There's one way to look at this and there's a right way and there's a wrong way. And that if there could be, I think perspective taking is exactly the word there, is like to take that beat and to try to consider this other person's point of view. And even if you don't disagree with it, to at least be able to acknowledge it, to show that you hear what it appears to be, or to even check to see if you have that right.
Yep.
Right or wrong. And that, you don't necessarily have to come to the same conclusion, but the conversation can be more productive when it has that perspective taking, understanding, empathy kind of at the core of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can even tag on at the end of when you communicate your own disagreement. I think it's always a good practice to actually pose a question to the other person and just say, am I missing anything? What's your perspective on this? It's showing that you may not have the full truth on your side. You have your own opinion on these subjects, but you're really inviting the other person to share how they see the situation. So again, it goes back to that practice of curiosity. You can build curiosity into the way that you communicate your own disagreements as well.
And do you think, is the advice the same whether you're a person who's been marginalized and you want to disagree with a person who's from a majority culture? Because the way we've been talking about it is vice versa. Do you think the principles are the same?
It's a great question, because we specifically wrote the book for the people who are in that ally position rather than from the perspective of the person who's in the marginalized position, because we felt that, so often the dynamics of these conversations, there is a burden that's placed on the member of the marginalized group to make sure the conversation's going well. And there's been, plenty of other books that have been written on that subject. And so we really wanted to attack it from the perspective, if you're in that higher power position, how do you navigate this conversation most effectively? However, I do think that as I think about the 7 principles in the book around, building resilience and cultivating curiosity and disagreeing respectfully and so forth. I hope that those ideas are going to be beneficial to people no matter where they enter the conversation from, because, we're all humans at the end of the day. And so we all can have a tendency to slip into unhelpful patterns of communication and, emotions that overcome us and make it more difficult for us to engage thoughtfully in dialogue with each other. And so I do, even though we've written the book more from those majority group members, I do hope that the techniques we have to offer in the book will be helpful more widely.
Yeah. I mean, I found myself, of course, when you read, you think about the way this relates to your own personal experience. And I realized so many of the examples that were coming to mind, there was a time where parents at my daughter's school were complaining to the teacher because she was talking about her LGBTQI plus identity. And that was a time where I avoided and I stayed silent and I didn't speak up, thinking about the conversational traps. And there was a conversation I had recently with a straight, cis, white male who was, I think, trying to align with me. We were talking about sexism, and his way of trying to align was to say, well, at my age, I'm becoming obsolete. He's like 47. At my age, I'm becoming obsolete. So I get it. I get what it's like to experience sexism. And I will admit, I responded very, very poorly to that. And ultimately, it sort of escalated into probably what would be considered the attacking kind of mode. And so I was thinking about, gosh, if I could go back and have a do-over, what do I need to do differently? And it did really feel like these principles would still apply. So ideally, those other people would be doing the work to maybe not land in this particular conversation in the first place. But the reality is we're often going to continue finding ourselves in this position. And I thought, gosh, yes, if I was able to reflect and, had more resilience around my emotions that got triggered. I will say in the sexist example, I had a couple drinks. And so that is probably also not a very good idea. So I do think that everything that I was reading about, if I could go back and have a do-over, I think a lot of this would be really helpful to make that conversation more productive and maybe even especially the curiosity. I mean, I'm so aware that just my immediate response was to be, angry and defensive and make assumptions about who someone is or their intention. And never asked a single question, just went after it.
Well, I'm glad you found it useful in that context and thinking about that, because, as you say, we would primarily have been writing this book for him. And I think,
Right.
if he had read the book with, just in a discerning way, I think he would have hopefully spotted in our section where we talk about deflection, that's what he was engaged in the deflection to yourself by saying, oh, I know what it's like to experience sexism because I'm a man and we're feeling obsolete. That's a classic form of deflecting to yourself. And so I hope he would have been able to spot that and had that cringe moment you were describing earlier where he would look back on that conversation and think, oh my goodness, I can't believe I just did that. Yeah. But I'm really, heartened to hear that even from your perspective on the other side of the conversation, you felt like some of these tools might have been helpful.
Yeah, I do. So you have a whole chapter on apologies. And I love, there's a quote in there. It's from John Cater, who calls apologies humanity's perfect response to imperfection. I just love that. So great. And, I think we know that apologies can be so healing, but they are so hard for us to genuinely offer. And I think that's, again, maybe it's because that feeling shame when you feel like you've made a mistake or done something wrong. And, they trigger that kind of vulnerability in that moment. And so when you talk about apologies, you say a true apology includes 4 R's: recognition, responsibility, remorse, and redress. So I think this is really important, that we all need to do a better job of trying to get apologies right. Of course, when we're having identity conversations, but this applies to any time that we've made a mistake or done something that's inconsistent with our values. So can you talk a little bit about what those 4 R's entail?
Absolutely. So the first one is recognition. And this is really about just recognizing the harm that was caused. So oftentimes, we get stuck at this point by using an if apology. So we'll say, I'm sorry if I offended you, or if you're upset, I'm sorry, or if I did anything, I'm sorry. And the problem with all of those formulations is that you're making it seem like the harm is somehow uncertain. If you're genuinely unsure if you hurt someone, then ask, show curiosity, make sure you've found out what it is. And then when it comes to apologizing, you could just apologize for it with proper recognition of that harm. Responsibility is about taking personal responsibility for causing the harm. And so here, people often will fall into the trap of using the word but, saying a but apology. So they'll say, I'm sorry, but I didn't mean it, or I'm sorry, but I was having a bad day, or I'm sorry, but I'm not a racist, or something like that. So a classic example here was the comedian Roseanne Barr, who sent out a tweet a number of years ago, a really highly racist tweet at 2 a.m. And then when she was called out for it the next day, her defense was, I'm sorry, but I was Ambien tweeting, right? So she was sort of blaming the fact that she was on Ambien for issuing this racist tweet. And so that's an example of where you're not really taking personal responsibility for what you did. Remorse is really about just communicating genuine contrition for causing the harm. So there isn't really a form of word or a word like if or but that shows that you're not communicating remorse. But it's really about displaying sincerity in the way that you're communicating so that it's clear you're not making excuses for their behavior. And so a good example of someone who didn't do a good job on the remorse aspect is the celebrity chef Mario Batali. So he was accused of sexually harassing multiple women, and he wrote an apology in his newsletter. And he sort of started out the apology in a way that sounded okay, like it sounded like he was on the right track toward a sincere apology. But then at the bottom in the newsletter, he added, P.S., here's a recipe for pizza dough cinnamon rolls if you're looking for a great holiday treat. And he, had a link to the recipe and a picture of the rolls. And I think that's sort of a very obvious example where I think most people reading that would wonder, are you really sincerely remorseful in your apology if you're throwing in a recipe for pizza dough cinnamon rolls in that newsletter, right? And so I think this is an example where you can either make the mistake of underdoing the remorse like that, or overdoing the remorse and berating yourself for what a terrible person you are. And in that instance, it might seem like you're remorseful, but what it has the effect of doing is it makes the other person who's been hurt by you, it turns them into the comforter who has to then reassure you that everything's okay, rather than you communicating your apology to them. So it's a little
like
bit
those
like
ally tears again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the final element is redress. And this is about really ensuring that you're backing the words of an apology with action. So I think one of the reasons why people sometimes don't like apologies is because they think it's all talk, no action, right? Anyone can utter the words of an apology, but if they go on and keep doing the same thing over and over, right, that's not
like
really
kids
great.
Infamously do, right?
Exactly.
They just parrot the words they know they're supposed to say, but the 4 R's are typically not there.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, redress is about just making sure that you change your behavior or you take whatever tangible steps in that situation might be necessary to repair the damage that you have done. And it may mean other conversations with the person. It may mean checking in with the other person just to ensure that your behavior has changed from their perspective since you offered the initial apology. And we think that really, if you think about those 4 R's of recognition, responsibility, remorse, and redress when you're giving an apology, you're well on your way, I think, to giving a good one. It doesn't need to be a big dramatic speech that goes on and on in an apology. You can do it in only a couple of sentences, but we think those 4 are the kind of guideposts to help you along the way.
Yeah. Have you ever heard the apology from Dan Harmon? So Dan Harmon was a writer of the show Community, among many other things, and he became kind of known, I think, outside of those circles because he was accused of some sort of sexual harassment of some kind. I think of a coworker, a female coworker. And he publicly apologized, and that apology has sort of been held up as a really good example of a true apology. And I'd have to go back and listen to it again. It's been a long time, but I'm pretty sure these 4 R's would be there. I can even try to find it and put it in our show notes if people want to see. But it was really like nothing I had ever heard or seen, like the level to which he really took responsibility. And of course, I don't know about redress or if he's changed over time. We haven't heard any other, bad news about him since that time. And I was so aware of my emotional response. Oh, I'm getting choked up right now just thinking about it. Like my emotional response to that wow, this was a long time ago. And it's like really making me get
Yeah.
tearful because it's so rare.
Yeah.
When you've been someone who's been wrong, to like genuinely have the person on the other side to be able to truly take responsibility and feel genuine remorse. I mean, these apologies are so powerful and so healing. And I think when we can do it and we can get it right, it just goes such an incredibly long way.
Yeah. I mean, we open the chapter on apologies with, a book called The Apology, written by V, who formerly known as Eve Ensler, who, writes this book offering this poignant, long-form apology from her father to her for abusing her as a child. And what's, really powerful and poignant, but also just so painful about that apology is that she had to write it herself. She waited her whole life to get an apology for her father, and she never got one, and he died, and then she had to write an apology from him to her. And so I think this just really speaks to what you're saying about it's just so rare for people in these positions of power to offer a deep, thoughtful, remorseful apology. But the impact of doing that, of actually giving that apology, is so profound that I think anyone who is maybe worried that it's going to make them more vulnerable or expose them to whatever, to criticism for offering an apology, I think should pause and think about, well, maybe what if offering this apology is actually going to heal the relationship that I have broken with this other person, and what impact might that have?
What if not only the opposite happens, but it actually makes things better?
Yep.
And, I know I have so many clients who just desperately wish they could get an apology from a parent. Yep. And it makes me think about my role as a parent, kind of going forward. I know I'm going to make so many mistakes, and not only how can I offer genuine apologies when that happens, it's also modeling genuine apologies. That was something that wasn't modeled to me really growing up. And I think it's so incredibly important. So we're getting toward the end of our time. I have one last question for you that doesn't actually have anything to do with the books, but I'm curious. It was kind of along the same lines of thinking about the word privilege and some of these things that have become kind of triggering in like modern times. And there's been a lot of news coverage of this new trend to change the words in books, like the Dr. Seuss books, in an effort to make them more, what's the word I'm looking for? Culturally sensitive, maybe. And I'm curious if you think, like, is this advancing the conversation or setting us back or something else altogether? Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, we don't write about this in the book, but I do have, my own kind of personal view about this subject, which is I don't really like this trend of going back and amending historical, artistic works and books and so forth, because I just think it's much more healthy for us to try to process and learn from, different standards, different cultures, different time periods, and the way that people express themselves, even if it's offensive or even if there's things that people wouldn't do, and put that in a context. So if you're teaching that in a classroom, you can actually set the table with the students and say, look, there are a lot of words in this book because it was written, 50 years ago or 100 years ago, whatever it is, that we just wouldn't use today. And, what's your analysis of that? Why do you think the author used that terminology? What kind of attitudes in the culture of that time might have led to people using that kind of language to depict certain groups? I think that kind of open conversation that around the content of this material is a healthier way to approach some of these topics than just going in there and taking a pen to it and sort of changing the language. I also think there's room for potentially saying, like you see sometimes on, I think Disney does this on some, of the older kids movies, right? You see pop up on the screen, kind of like you have a warning of sort of this is rated R or this is rated whatever. They'll have a little thing. I have 2 young kids. We watch sort of Disney movies sometimes. It'll pop up on the screen and say, this contains stereotypical depictions of, such and such a group. Those depictions were wrong then and they're wrong now. And we hope this will stimulate conversation about, how to be more inclusive or, something along those lines.
Yeah,
I think that kind of notice is a more helpful way of contextualizing it for people and hopefully creating the kinds of conversations that we want to create around the book of like, how can we be more inclusive going forward?
I love that. I've never seen those pop-ups, but that's really interesting. Yeah. So it's like using it as an opportunity, as a teaching tool, really. And the other thing it made me think of is I wonder if these changes are actually fueling the fear of cancel culture. Like, oh, geez, even Dr. Seuss just got essentially canceled and he's dead. Like he can't even respond to it, that it might even stoke those fears of like anything I say or do now might come back to haunt me, down the road.
Yeah, I think we're living at a time now where there's a lot of opportunity that people, the opponents of diversity and inclusion, people who actually want to shut down these conversations, people who oppose social justice, I think it gives some fuel to their fire to be able to say, look at the, censorious people who are telling you what to think and telling you what to say. And so my approach to this question is much more, I don't want to give them that fuel. I want to encourage inclusive behavior, but I want to do it in a way that still creates room for, free speech and other principles as well.
Right. Well, thanks for entertaining that question. I was really curious about your thoughts. This has been such a great conversation. I really appreciate you joining me. Tell our listeners if they want to learn more about you. Again, the book is Say the Right Thing, How to Talk About Identity, Diversity, and Justice, and you co-wrote it with your colleague, Kenji Yoshino. Where can people find out more about you, David, if they want to do that?
So Kenji and I both work at the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. So if you just Google Meltzer Center, I'm sure you'll be able to find us. It's at NYU School of Law. And then you can also find me on LinkedIn or Twitter if you want to follow along me personally.
And are you at David Glasgow?
At DV Glasgow.
At DV Glasgow. Okay, we will look for you there, and I will put all of that in the show notes. So thank you so much. This has been great.
Well, thank you so much, Jill.
Hey, Psychologist Off the Clock listeners, I'm going to guess that if you got to the end of this episode, that you also love to geek out about books in psychology.
If you don't know where to store all your books and people are already complaining that you talk about this book that you're reading all the time, then why don't you join us once a month to read a book together?
If you're interested in joining us, we hope you are. Just send an email to offtheclockpsych@gmail.com and we'll send you more information.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our strategic consultant, Michael Harold, and our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're having a mental health emergency, dial 911. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.